This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Welcome back to the Friday podcast, all. To channel my inner Excalibur here, the single worst commentator in the history of professional wrestling. You know what that means. Well, if you've been following the show, you know what it means. It's Friday. Last week was a bit of a change of pace with only being able to do the pay-per-view recap. But this week we're back to talking about WCW Saturday Night on the Superstation, as well as Midsouth TV. Hopefully everyone's doing well. If you had an extended 3-day weekend because of the holiday this past week, hope you're all well rested. I honestly did not know how badly I needed the 3-day weekend until I woke up Monday and looked around and said, my apartment is absolutely filthy. I need to clean and tidy up a bit. And I'm what I would consider a reasonably clean person. You know, I do the dishes consistently, clean up after myself. But even I occasionally need to wipe down the bathroom. So that's what my day consisted of. Cleaning my place, reading a bunch, writing music, and no, that was about it. I also watched a little bit of modern wrestling in the background, and I'm not going to say what I watched. All I'll say is that I tried to give a particular product a shot again to see if they could impress me. They did not impress me. Some would have you believe it was a good event. I, on the other hand, viewed it as nothing more than same story, different day. All right, fine, I'll tell you what I watched. It was the AEW pay-per-view. Whatever the show was they ran from Queens. Double or Nothing, I think it was. The fact that I'm not entirely sure offhand, that should tell you everything you need to know. I don't know what enticed me to want to try to give it a shot. All I know is that I'm glad I used the illegal stream and didn't actually plunk out money to order it. Because that would have been a wasteful investment. And yes, I watched the whole thing. Well, not the pre-show stuff. The main card. I also may or may have not left the room during the girls' matches. I even suffered through football field fuckery. Or whatever that stupid circle jerk session was they had on the field. The one that always sucks, but they still do it. 4.5 hours of my life that I will never get back. And you know, the story is pretty much the same as where we left it in 2023. It's still AEW. It's still a miserably niche, miserably dull product that appeals to the lowest common denominator of fans. To quote Jim Cornette, it's a product for the kind of people that like that kind of thing. I don't know what else to tell you. But you'll be happy to hear the formatting of this channel is going to remain the same. And so why don't we dive in with the classic reviews. So we are a week removed from the hellscape that was Capital Combat 90. I'm sure if you're watching this channel already, you've seen the review. If you haven't, it's well worth a listen, especially if you enjoy long, angry rants. But I've had a week to calm down and collect my thoughts. I have not thought about, nor have I had the desire to recount anything on that godforsaken 3-hour horror show. It's behind us, and now we can shift our focus onto the big summer spectacular, better known as the Great American Bash. And whereas at one point, the Great American Bash tour was one of the more signature pockets of the NWA business throughout the months of June and July, I don't even know if they were officially calling it the Great American Bash Tour by this point in 1990. I mean, they had already somewhat neutered the concept the previous year when they were doing tours in all these bumfuck cities that weren't even high-drawing markets for the NWA. And while the 89 Bash pay-per-view in Baltimore is still positively acclaimed, especially from smarter fans, it was the first year where, God, I still hate even using this word. It's like my least favorite word to use in the English language because of its connotation. But it did not feel like a Great American Bash tour. There you go, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. But all seriousness, go back and look at last year. They didn't promote it. They ran junky towns and did horrible gates in the majority of the places they ran. The cards were lackluster. The talent pool just wasn't there. You know, certainly compared to who they had in 85, 86, 87, even 88. And now we're in 1990. We've already seen the company do everything in their power to run off fans in droves. It's just not a good time. And now that they've completely revamped their booking committee yet again, Ole's now the one overseeing a lot of the direction of things, and I mean, the shows are a direct reflection of the Ole Anderson style of booking. The best way I can sum it up is Ole was coming up with content that worked in Georgia in 1977, and now he's trying to force fit it in front of a smarter fan base that didn't really take too kindly to it. While at the same time, he's also using talent from 1977 and thinking they still had the same drawing power in the 90s. That was another critical issue. Getting into some of what happened on this week's Saturday night show, they opened with Johnny Ace and Tommy Rich versus State Patrol. At this rate, I think it's safe to assume that Shane Douglas was gone from the company. See, here's the thing I forgot about, though. I remember Shane went to the WWF in 1990, but for some reason I had it in my mind that he didn't show up until like post-SummerSlam. I didn't realize he left as far back as April. But it explained why Johnny was teaming up with Tommy Rich here. Poor Tommy. He drew the short straw this week. Now, one of their focal themes for this episode was hyping up the big announcements surrounding the Horsemen. They brought out Flair to join Cornette and Ross on commentary to try to downplay the whole thing. It wasn't so much an announcement regarding the Horsemen. It was someone they were bringing in to combat the Horsemen. Keep this all in the back of your mind on that topic we were mentioning about Ole still thinking he was booking wrestling like it was the 70s. So anyway, they had a very boring tag match. My favorite part had nothing to do with the actual match. It was when Jim Cornette buried the tagline for the upcoming Clash event on the 13th of June. They were calling it Coastal Crush, to which Cornette responded with, Coastal Crush? Sounds like a soft drink. In his defense, it was a pretty stupid name. Coastal Crush. Think about that. Somebody came up with the idea for that and said, that's genius. I can only speculate on who that might have been. So after several boring minutes, Tommy Rich got the win on Buddy Parker with a Thez press. My conclusion here was they needed to find Johnny a partner and figured, well, Tommy Rich has bleached blonde hair. Let's pair them up together. Because it worked so well when they had Shane Douglas as the better half of Johnny Ace. It'll work splendidly with Wildfire Tommy Rich. No, it did not. The people still did not care. And so following that, we had Flair and Ole come out to confront JR about the big surprise that the Turner Network is holding over the Horsemen. It was one of those talking in circles type deals where they never directly mention who it was. Ole tried to get Jim to spill the beans, but couldn't get him to budge. What we do know, as of this point, is that Flair will not be defending his world title against Sting or Luger anytime in the near future. Which, and they've really done an effective job in twisting that knife further into Luger's back, haven't they? After all that overbooked nonsense at the pay-per-view, the fact that we didn't even get a clean finish, now they're basically like, yeah, well, we're moving on from the Luger thing. No rematch for him. I mean, it's one thing for the Horsemen to say that part out loud, but no, I mean, the company was basically saying that. Luger got fucked again, and now they're just immediately moving on with the next challenger. That poor guy literally could not catch a break. Oh, and speaking of Luger, while we're on the topic, this was mind-bogglingly dumb. We all know the deal with Luger in the weeks leading up to Capital Combat. He had the staph infection that put him in the hospital for days. The doctors were telling him that he shouldn't wrestle because he could severely damage his leg further if he put too much weight on it. It was a big thing. And so, after we've already seen Luger fail to capture the title, after we've seen him work the cage match and power his way through, they decide now to air the tape of Luger in the hospital bed, where he's talking with Tony Schiavone about the pay-per-view and how he'll be ready to compete after the pay-per-view has already aired. That is prototypical WCW for this time. Instead of airing the video on the Saturday before the pay-per-view, no, let's air it after we've already seen Luger fail to win the world title for the 800th time in 3 years. The idiocy of these people never ceases to amaze me. So then we pitched back to JR and Cornette so they could bring out one of their special guests for this week's taping. They actually had a handful of these. And I'm talking about none other than Mr. Wrestling 2. Another good friend of Ole, dating back to, surprise, surprise, the late 70s. And I love this. They bring in Mr. Wrestling 2 for a cameo, literally so he could show up, cut a promo about the big surprise for later on, without actually giving away any detail about what he may or may have not already known about it. I believe we were inclined to think that Mr. Wrestling 2 had insight on who the surprise was, but of course he's being all vague and cryptic about it. But again, the segment was utterly useless. And I like Mr. Wrestling 2. I was a big fan of his Midsouth run. The great stuff he was involved with during his run there, the tag team with Magnum TA, the heel run he had at the tail end. But like, objectively speaking, this segment was utterly pointless. It served no use. We did have one good line here when Cornette was talking about the finishing knee lift, to which Wrestling 2 said, "Don't worry, that knee lift is only reserved for men, and you would know nothing about that." You could even see Corny slightly breaking character for a minute when he cracked a smile. The thing is that I wouldn't necessarily say that Mr. Wrestling 2 was ever a dynamite promo. He'd have some occasional good lines here and there, but generally he wasn't a great talker. But that was a good shot. He came up with that one on the fly, and you could tell Cornette was proud of him. And so then we went back to the ring for Arn Anderson versus Paul Drake. Double A is now the television champion, which of course brings up the apparent question of who in the hell was the previous TV champion before Arn beat him? The answer? I ain't got the first fucking clue. To tell you the truth, I don't remember the last time the TV championship was even mentioned, much less defended. Meanwhile, Arn just shows up this week with the title around his waist. Not that I'm complaining. Fuck, to me it's still a toss-up between him and Tully as the top television champions of all time. And those two had some great title defenses back during the Pete Crockett years. We did hear that he was defending the belt against Paul Orndorff at the next Clash event. Paul was another one of those special guests they were hyping up throughout the program. Not the big surprise, though. So Double A won with the DDT in about a minute. It was fine, but just a simple enhancement squash. And that took us to this interview with Rocky King. And the central theme of this goofy program continues. You'll be shocked to hear, somehow through the grapevine, Rocky was clued in on who the big surprise was for later on. So at this point, we can basically conclude that the whole thing was a giant company-wide rib. The only people on the roster that didn't know about anything regarding the big surprise were Ric Flair, Ole and Arn Anderson, and for whatever reason, Jim Cornette. Everyone else, though, up and down the card, even all the way down to the enhancement guys, they were all clued in. But of course, they can't reveal who it is, because then it wouldn't be a surprise, you see. The only clue we got from Rocky was that and I quote, he is from his side of the tracks. Or as Jim Ross put it here, his main man. You know, at that point, they may as well have just broke out all the black slander. Why not go all the way with it at that point? His main man. His home slice. No, never mind. What the fuck is going on here? So we were supposed to get Rocky King versus Cactus Jack, but Flair and Ole interrupted and basically threatened Rocky by demanding he reveal the big secret. Elsewise, they were going to take care of him. Make of that as you wish. And this was just... It was so great because God bless Rocky King. I know Dusty liked him and used him pretty reliably underneath several years back. And he was always a great athlete with $1 million body. Very professional, always did what he was told. At the same time, you can tell just how giddy he was about getting the opportunity to do this angle with Flair and Ole. Because he's in there getting berated and lambasted and talked down to. And he's all smiles. He literally cannot stop grinning from ear to ear as he's being reprimanded and threatened by these two mean, smug heels. It was like watching a fan interacting with someone who's clearly trying to be in character, but the fan knows he's working and it's complete bullshit. That's what Rocky King looked like here. He was like a fan getting to interact with his idols. It was so great. And so right as Ole and Flair were about to leave him for dead, we get the big surprise reveal. It's JYD. Now let's pause for a minute. Let's take a trip down memory lane for a sec. 1 week ago, as a matter of fact, the Capital Combat pay-per-view, there was a segment where Tony Schiavone interviewed who else but the returning Junkyard Dog. So in other words, the big surprise was the return of a wrestler who already made his surprise return on pay-per-view 1 week prior to this taping. Was their mentality that nobody was ordering WCW pay-per-views at this time? So they figured more than 50% of the fan base didn't already know that JYD was back? I mean, I get we're still pre-internet age here, but I'm trying to rationalize this in my head because it literally makes no sense. We already saw JYD show back up. The cat was already out of the bag. So by the time he showed up here, it fundamentally would not have been a surprise. Except for the people that didn't see the pay-per-view. Now, granted, he got a big pop from the fans. I'm not arguing here that there weren't fans who weren't already clued into JYD coming back. Obviously, there were going to be a handful of people that didn't know about this ahead of time. But if they were going to hype it up as a big surprise for television, well, why did they have JYD do a promo at the pay-per-view then? They should have saved his actual on-camera return for television. And I've already kind of said my piece on the Dog's run in 1990. And you showed up here looking fatter than I'd ever seen him before, wearing zebra-printed pants no less. This did not help to mask his appearance. He was still JYD. He still had a passionate, loyal fan base behind him. They went ballistic when he got physical with Flair and threw him around for a bit. I would argue it was more so Flair overselling to try to make it look somewhat believable. I mean, this is the title match they're booking for the Clash in a few weeks. Whatever you want to say, I'm certainly not going to come out and defend the idea of signing off on this. In 1990? Hell, if this were taking place in the Superdome in 1982 when we were getting peak physical condition JYD, sure, absolutely. I'd have bought a fucking ticket to see that live. And unfortunately, that's not what we were getting at this stage. Even Flair wasn't capable of smoking and mirroring that calamity. It just is what it is, man. It's another textbook case of Ole trying to book like it's 20 years prior, just not understanding that the talent pool he either worked with or knew back in the day were not at the same peak performance level. I mean, you can put JYD on TV in 1990 and think you're going to get the same JYD that was kicking ass from the late 70s up through the early to mid 1983 time period. But as we came to find out, that version of JYD was a thing of the past. I mean, this is no different from the same complaints we all used to have when TNA kept trying to force fit all those legends and big stars into main event roles well past their prime years. God, remember the whole main event Mafia debacle when they were putting Nash and Steiner and Sting over all the TNA established stars like AJ and Joe? It was like clear as day that none of them could believably kick their asses in a real fight. Yet they were still being forced over and booked to steamroll like 90% of the roster. I mean, yes, there's having name power and drawing power, but at some point there has to be a realization that some guys are better off doing public appearances to sign autographs or greet fans, the more behind-the-scenes projects, as opposed to being in the ring with their shirt off. Because in a lot of those cases, they get very quickly exposed. And that's sort of the reality of what happened with JYD. The people saw him come back and they were happy. But as soon as he got in the ring, completely different narrative. So, moving on from that depressing topic, they did Doug Furnas versus Zan Panzer, which I basically use as my piss break segment. They did some wrestling spots. Furnas won with a dropkick. He did give Panzer one of the best snap belly-to-belly throws I've ever seen. You know, that's the thing with Doug Furnas, though. He did so much great athletic stuff back in the day, but he's another one of those guys who they brought in, did absolutely nothing with from a booking standpoint. So he's just another one of those jags on the roster who floats around and does occasional TV matches whenever they need to fill airtime. But he's unimportant. He's among 80 other guys who fell into that same trap. Those follow with a Mr. Wonderful promo where he hyped up his match with Arn for the Clash. Didn't really know much about the promo aside from Paul planning on taking care of business. It was pretty cut and dry. You know, it's funny. People remember Paul Orndorff for having that late WCW run. I was talking about the one during the Monday Night War period. For me, I remember like two things offhand that he ever did. I remember him as a heel coming out to the ring with that handheld mirror while they played that epic Mr. Wonderful theme music. And I also remember them doing the angle on Nitro where he got into the fight with the Horsemen, and he ended up taking a pile driver from Arn on the concrete. I think that was their way of writing him off TV because Paul legitimately had to retire because of the muscle atrophy situation he was dealing with. But those are like the only things I remember from that late period. But he also had a great run in like 93 when he came back and won the TV title as a heel. He had those series of matches with Ricky Steamboat at one point that I remember being pretty great. And bearing in mind that he was already semi-retired after the WWF run, people often overlook how good he still was during the later stages of his career. His run in Smoky Mountain, that was awesome. I don't have vivid memories of what he did in 1990 personally. I know he pretty much feuds with the Horsemen through most of the year and affiliates with the other top babyfaces like Sting and Luger and JYD. Whatever they were calling themselves. The dudes with attitudes. Good God. That's about my only memory of that time frame. Is me cringing at the concept of dudes with attitudes. It's embarrassingly 1990s. They wonder why people stopped liking the baby faces over time. We had Doom versus Jerry Price and Tim Parker. Quick squash win for Doom. The best part was after hitting the Doomsday on one of the job guys, Ron Simmons was doing push-ups on the guy's chest during the pinfall. I'm sure that was only mildly uncomfortable. We also had the Steiners taking on Bubba Rose and Joe Cruz. I'm pretty sure, wasn't there a squash match we talked about a while back when Bubba Rose was teaming up with someone, and the boys ended up beating the shit out of Bubba for like 90% of the match while the other job guys stood on the apron and watched? That's essentially what they did here too. Rick and Scott just pulverized this fucker for minutes on end. Cruz didn't even bother tagging in. He just left Rose to eat the bulk of the match. And after getting thrown around and destroyed forever, Rick finally put him away with a middle rope belly to belly. The highlight was him getting Rose in position for it, and then right before he grabbed him around the waist to throw him, Rick screams, "Here we go!" And you see him laugh as he tosses Rose overhead. It was a beautiful throw. Guy landed perfectly flat on his back. Safest belly-to-belly suplex you've ever seen. But it was funny. Keep in mind, too, that these guys literally just lost the World Tag Titles on pay-per-view not less than a week prior. They don't give a shit. They're just out there having fun and doing what Rick and Scott do best. Belts or no belts. They get paid to show up and beat people up. And that took us to this Nature Boy promo with JR where, well, in no uncertain terms, he vowed that JYD would not become the first black world champion in wrestling history, which is practically their selling point for the title match at the Clash. I know how we'll get people to care about this match. Let's pull the race card storyline. Talked about how JYD would never high-five legends like Mike Tyson or Michael Jordan, nor would he ever get to call himself champ at Flair's expense. His issues with the dog go beyond professional levels. It got personal when he came in and got physical with the $6 million champ's custom suit, which is such a great heel quote. It's strictly business until you lay a hand on Flair's custom suit jacket. Then the shit's on, brother. I mean, it was pretty paint-by-numbers Flair verbiage. Not much else to note beyond them using this match to sell their racial justice storyline. In 1990, no less. God, and we still haven't changed as a culture. We're still pulling this racial bullshit in 2026. Anyway, that led to the Legion of Doom versus Nasty Ned and Rick Fargo. So I guess I should take back what I said about their final appearance being at the Capital Combat pay-per-view. Apparently they did work a series of TV matches afterward, before they left. Who'd have thunk? Can't imagine they're around for that much longer, though. I know for a fact they don't work the Great American Bash pay-per-view in July. There was a pre-tape promo they did beforehand. I was out of the room for it, so I didn't catch what they were ranting about. I know it's easy enough to say, well, you could have just rewound it. Touché. I figured it wasn't all that important. They won with the Doomsday in about 45 seconds. And that was followed with a Sting Tommy Rich promo. They were basically there to promote next week's TV main event. They're going to team up to wrestle, I believe they said Arn and Rick. Although it might be Arn and Barry. Wasn't entirely sure. They're going to fight some combination of the Horsemen next week. And without directly naming their team Dudes with Attitudes, they essentially alluded to such by mentioning the word attitude every other sentence, suggesting that it's going to be Sting, Wildfire, Luger, Orndorff, and JYD all working on the same page to combat the numbers game of the Horsemen. As they're taking into account that Ole's also an honorary Horseman, which would explain the 5-on-5 scenario. It was a fine little go-home babyface promo. Do not ask me how Wildfire Tommy Rich found his way into this random collection of top babyfaces. At this point, I'm trying not to ask too many questions about the logic of booking with WCW, because boy is it beyond superfluous. I mean, this show was pretty much built around the big reveal of JYD, which again was silly because we already saw the dog return at Capital Combat to cut a promo. So we knew about his big surprise return before they even shot his actual return on TV. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've seen that Flair JYD match. From what I recall, it's one of the only standout moments on that entire Clash event, which is petrifying when you consider how terrible that match was historically. I mean, we all know the main objective is them getting to Sting and Flair at the Bash in July. I don't think anybody ever actually bought the idea that the dog was going to win the world title. But it's not going to make the sight of it any easier to digest. Alright, well, as we cruise into the Midsouth television program, we had a lot going on this week. When they made the announcement at the top of the program that Ric Flair would be in action, kind of figured this one was going to be a must-see episode. Now, obviously, we did not review last week's show because of the Capital Combat review. Naturally, Joel Watts and JR talked about how grand and exciting everything was. Basically guilt-tripping me, saying, if you didn't see the show, then boy, were you missing out. So immediately I went, damn it. Of course, we missed a really exciting episode. Well, one of those exciting moments came in the form of the return of Hacksaw Duggan. And the clip they aired was absolutely magnificent. So they're getting ready to start a match between Dr. Death and some Hammenegger. And before they can ring the bell, out comes Jim Duggan with a giant-ass bandage over his face. To put it bluntly, he looked like Mankind, but instead of having a brown leather mask, it was just a big white bandage of protective wrap. And so he immediately chases down Skandar Akbar and grabs a hold of him. And in one of the more comedic moments of Akbar's selling career, Duggan has him by the back of his pants. And you see Akbar doing the cartoon villain animation where he's stammering in place trying to run away from Duggan. And of course he ends up getting taken out, as did Dr. Death. And then after he sent the heels packing, all the underneath baby faces came out and started high-fiving them. It's one of those moments where not a single person in the Irish McNeil Boys Club was sitting down for it. Everybody leapt to their feet, cheering and screaming for Duggan when he came out. It was so tremendous. And I rewound that Akbar bit and watched it at least half a dozen times. Seeing him run in place like a Scooby-Doo character while Duggan had a handful of his pants. Like, nobody thinks to do that kind of shit in today's business. Not saying that I'm somebody who prefers silly cartoon managers above serious ones. But every so often, when you see a babyface actually get his hands on the chicken shit heel manager and make him look like a goofball, you're reminded, oh yeah, that's right. Wrestling psychology actually used to make a bit of sense. And so that set up Kamala's squash match with Mike Simani this week. I seem to recall Mike Simani doing jobs on Crockett TV. Yeah, every now and then I see the graphics pop up for these enhancement guys and I think, pretty sure so-and-so did jobs for Crockett too. So, well, the match is pretty straightforward. Kamala won with a running splash in about a minute. The thing I want to talk about is Akbar's promo beforehand, where I'm still not entirely sure what was going on here. As he's ranting about Duggan and Cowboy Watts, he's also trying to light a cigar in his mouth. And there's like a 10 to 15 second pause where it looks like he's trying to set something up with the cigar. Like he was threatening to set off another fireball or whatever, but the cigar wasn't cooperating. I don't know, it was just very awkward. There were peculiar moments of silence during this promo. I think he eventually just gave up and did a normal heel promo. It's hard to explain. There was some attempt at doing a visual here, and apparently it did not go according to plan. So he just moved on and gave up trying. That always seems par for the course in wrestling, doesn't it? Whenever you need the gimmick to actually function properly, it never does. So from there, we came back for Terry Taylor versus the Nightmare. This is for the North American Championship. And before we rang the bell here to start it, Ric Flair came out to do a promo, stating that even though Terry is still currently the #1 contender for the NWA World Heavyweight title, Rick has enough confidence that the Nightmare can win the North American title on television today. He's going to give him and Eddie Gilbert $10,000 to leave Terry on his backside and take home the gold. Now we'll talk about what they booked for a finish here. I assumed the implication would be if the Nightmare became the new North American champion, that would automatically qualify him as the number one contender for the NWA World Heavyweight title. To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure that was the case. They never mentioned anything about it. I mean, Flair acknowledged that Taylor is currently the number one contender, but he was also putting down money that the Nightmare could become the new North American champion, thus invalidating Taylor as the next challenger for the World Heavyweight title. One would think. Now, we've obviously been following Eddie Gilbert and the Nightmare's run in Mid-South since they showed up. They've been well protected when it comes to their booking and presentation. It's apparent that Watts saw big things in both of them when he brought him in. When they laid out the gauntlet here ahead of time, instinctually you kind of had to figure that something was up. The title change was pretty self-evident, especially when Flair was just hanging around ringside playing cheerleader for the heels. With that all said, it's a really good television match. A lot of the early to mid stages was Taylor getting worked over and fighting from underneath, but they really cranked it up in the closing several minutes with the back and forth between both guys, keeping people on the edge of their seats with both guys vying for control. The overall story, though, was more heavily revolved around Taylor kind of being a bit of a dolt, because he had the match won after he hit the Nightmare with a running forearm, but because Flair was outside the ring, Taylor wanted to stick it to him by trying to get the win with a figure four leg lock. So that set up all the interference spots with Flair hitting the apron so Gilbert could pull the Nightmare into the ropes. There was a counter spot where Taylor broke free of the pile driver and launched Eddie into the ring so he could knock him silly. And while that was going on, Flair fed the Nightmare a gimmick so he could hide it in his mask and then headbutt Taylor to steal the pinfall. And again, I don't want to completely undermine Taylor for looking like a chump in all this, but I mean, he did essentially screw himself over here. That being said, it was a prototypical Mid-South chaotic finish scenario. The people were into everything. The environment was hot. And they gave this match a lot of time, too. They went somewhere in the ballpark of 12 to 13 minutes. That doesn't seem like a lot by today's standards, but, bearing in mind that they've only got an hour for each TV episode, and most Mid-South matches already have a 10-minute time limit to begin with, they let this one go a while, and it was quite enjoyable. So we will see how things develop as the new North American champion reigns supreme. It has been several years since I've gone back and binged watched the Mid-South series. I have vague memories of the Nightmare winning the North American title. Not entirely sure how or when he drops it. I know he and Eddie end up winning the Mid-South tag titles at some point later this year, but I don't remember much about the Nightmare's run as the North American champion. So that'll be fun, going back and recalling how that whole timeline pans out. And so from there, well, we were supposed to get Ric Flair versus Terry Daniels in what they billed as a standby match. Yeah. Ric fucking Flair came to Mid-South television to wrestle in a standby. You had to figure that was going to be complete blatant false advertising. Turns out it was exactly that. This is a glorified TV angle. So Duggan intervenes before the bell and gets up in Flair's face, saying that he doesn't appreciate Flair showing up on Midsouth turf and disrespecting the former North American champion like he did. So Flair responds by calling Taylor a loser, saying he couldn't handle the pressure of being the champion. And moreover, Flair does not appreciate Duggan stepping into his ring and getting in his face. Said if Duggan keeps persisting, he's going to wind up with two bad eyes. And to the surprise of absolutely nobody, Duggan ends up firing the first shot and punching Flair right in the mouth. The best part, well, actually, there were two great parts here. I'll touch on the second one at the end. But I love the visual here. The entire time Duggan is beating up on Flair and whipping him around the ring like a government mule, fucking Terry Daniels, he's just in the background, trying to dodge and get out of the way to the best of his ability. At one point, I literally yelled, "Get the hell out of the ring, you idiot." And he eventually did get out of the ring. He was thrown out by Kamala and Skandar Akbar. They picked their spot to come in to try to gang up on Duggan for a few minutes, which in part led to the second best part of the segment. Kamala goes up top to try to give Duggan a big splash, and as Duggan breaks free and goes to roll out of the ring, he lifts up the apron skirt to try to grab a chair. And you will be shocked when I tell you this. There was no chair to be found under this ring. Because evidently, well, see my previous comments about uncooperative gimmicks. Another one of my favorite laughable tropes in wrestling. Somebody plans a spot with a folding chair, and it's usually one of two things. They either forget which side of the ring they hid the chair under, or even better, they forgot to hide the chair, period. But that is what made this part epic. As Duggan's about to go to the other side of the ring to try to find a chair, right as he's rounding the corner, a woman in the front row catches his attention. She hands Duggan the chair, and without hesitation, Duggan snatches it right from her hands and immediately hits the ring to chase off the heels. That was a great fucking audible call. That woman should have earned free tickets to the next month of Midsouth tapings. She surveyed the situation, realized Duggan didn't have an equalizer, and she said, "I'm going to help my fellow babyface friend out. Have my chair, Hacksaw." Awesome. Not to say that Ric Flair versus Terry Daniels would have been bad, but no, this was a much better payoff. All worth it to see that shot of the fan giving her seat to Duggan so he could chase off those nasty smug heels. The things you will never see in this business anymore is wrestling fans voluntarily trying to help the babyfaces out. So then we had Brickhouse Brown and Brad Armstrong versus Vern Deaton and the Bruiser. Vern Deaton, I believe, also ended up wrestling as Vernon Deaton in Crockett Promotions. I explicitly remember Vernon Deaton because he was a horrible wrestler. And his name was also incredibly stupid. I have no idea who the Bruiser was here, but he also sucked. This was one of those squashes that was almost worth going back to rewatch a second time. Just to see Deaton and the Bruiser try to sell for these two. They had no earthly clue what the hell they were doing. The rope running was dreadfully hideous and funny at the same time. It went about a minute. Brickhouse and Armstrong went over with a double team combo. Them as a tag team is just... It's one of those blaring examples of, we have two guys that we're paying for a hand-select amount of dates, but we really don't have a whole lot for them in terms of booking plans. So let's just put them in an underneath team and have them wrestle TV squashes. I've said this at least 3,000 times in the last several years. I like Brad Armstrong. By that same token, I've never had anything against Brickhouse Brown, but I can't be the only one, right? They are the literal definition of a set of guys. To be fair, I know Brad is about to leave for Mid-Atlantic pretty soon. I have no idea where Brickhouse ends up when he leaves the territory. I know at some point he winds back up in Memphis and has a relatively decent run as a singles for a while. Of course, in 1988 or whenever it was, a successful run in Memphis was pretty much on par with being the nicest guy in prison. Bloom was kind of off the rose at that point. There's a really infamous TV angle with him in the stud stable where they show up and present him with a watermelon before one of the heels ends up beating the shit out of him with a strap. I explicitly remember seeing that clip because it's one of those deals in wrestling where I saw that for the first time and thought, they could not do that on television today if they wanted to. That is pushing the envelope a little too far. I would even argue it's a little dodgy. Sidebar comment here as well. I actually read about this a couple years after he died, and I didn't even know about this. Apparently, Brickhouse was still wrestling well up until about a year before he died. It was really tragic, too. I believe the story was that he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but he also had a lot of overlying complications that affected his weight. And it wasn't, I don't think, a year later where he ended up being pronounced dead. I'm sure there's a lot of missing details in that story, but I'm going by memory. We had the Snowman versus Jim Jeffers, which was bad, but at least it was short. He pinned Jeffers with a power slam in about 30 seconds. That's all I care to note about that one. That took us to Dutch Mantell and Tom Pritchard versus Mark Reagan and Frank Lane. Now, that is a dream team that I never thought about. Dirty Dutch and Dr. Tom. Classic heel pairing right there. They basically took turns beating on Reagan until he managed to give Lane a hot tag. And they actually let Lane get in some offense there for a few seconds. He, well, put it this way. I have seen far worse babyface comebacks before. He did fine. Of course, then the heels immediately cut him off and Dutch got the win with a gore buster. Kind of hoping we see more tag team work with Mantell and Pritchard. They should try and think of a clever name while they're at it. They can call themselves, oh, I don't know, the Dirty Doctors. Yeah, I know, that was terrible. I guess I should also briefly touch on the post-match angle where the Snowman came out to run off the heels. They tried to restrain Mark Reagan so Dutch could strap him with his bullwhip. And it was one of those angles where you can tell that the snowman missed his cue because Dutch is literally standing there for like a full minute waiting to get cut off. He had ample opportunity to just whip the shit out of Reagan with his bullwhip. But he's just standing there and waiting for what seemed like hours on end. Literally so the snowman could show up and steal the whip away from him. Good. I presume this will be a TV feud. Poor Dutch. The hell did he do to deserve that treatment? I know I referenced that interview he did some odd years ago, where he basically talked about how much he hated his Mid-South run and how miserable he was down there. Now that I'm seeing this all again and realizing how underutilized Dutch had been since he showed up, I don't blame him. This run is kind of sucky. And so then we had scheduled Ted DiBiase and Dr. Death versus Bill Dundee and Wendell Cooley in the closing standby. Our first look at Wendell Cooley in Mid-South. And as quickly as we got to see him, there quickly he went. I have absolutely zero memory of this brawl ever taking place. You know, again, it's been a while since I've gone back and seen the whole 1985 Mid-South library in full. But holy shit, was this closing segment awesome. Now, a couple things to bear in mind here. DiBiase and Dr. Death are still heels. And so are the men that confronted them to demand a tag title shot. I'm talking about Jake Roberts and the Barbarian. Right as they were about to start, Jake and the Barbarian come in. They issue a challenge to DiBiase and Dr. Death, which leads to DiBiase responding by explaining that he and Steve waited 6 months to get the belts, and they're not about to let a slithering snake and a muscle head come in and start demanding title shots. They need to get to the back of the line and work their way up like everybody else. My favorite moment in this promo, it was a subtle thing, but it worked so well. I don't believe we've ever heard the Barbarian say a word since he came to Mid-South. But when he looked DiBiase in the eye and called him a weasel, and DiBiase retorted by going, "Back off, musclehead." Such an hysterically epic moment. And so they ended up getting into a fight, which was equally epic. And see, the reason this works so perfectly is both teams had the advantage at certain points in the fight. So they try to present them as if they were both on equal playing fields, even though the champions ended up getting run off at the very end. But what also made it great is nobody from the locker room came out to try to break it up. Heels or baby faces. And that makes sense, because these four obviously don't have any kind of alliance with the other baby faces. So they're certainly not going to come out to help. Likewise, from the other heels' perspective, why would they give a shit about what's going on in the ring? They're probably up there laughing it up and watching these meatheads all try to jockey for position. So I loved all this. And again, I do not remember ever seeing this angle take place. Probably should have, considering how big it got over in the building. But this is a very interesting scenario they set up. A heel versus heel program, which, not that that was out of the ordinary to see back in the day during this time, they were rare, but it's not like they hadn't been done before. I think the reason I find this so interesting is it came right out of nowhere, and around the same time they're also hyping out the return of the Rock and Roll Express next week. So I kind of like the dichotomy of introducing another heel team into the equation by getting them involved, but at the same time, they still haven't resolved everything with the Rock and Roll Express challenging for the belts. So it's a fascinating story development. And like I said, it was a great hot way to close out the show. God, people were going ballistic for that too. The funny thing is, they didn't even directly cheer for anybody. I think they were just excited to see four meatheads go at it. But yeah, I thought this episode fired on all cylinders. Lots of angles, lots of crazy stuff going on. But between the North American title match, the closing brawl with the heels, Duggan's run-ins at various points with Flair and Akbar respectively, I talk about it all the time, but this is the kind of stuff that attracted me to the Mid-South style of wrestling. An extension of the Memphis style, yes, but obviously with different talent pool and, I would argue, somewhat upgraded ideas. It still doesn't really stack up to what they were doing the year previously, but we're still riding a hot streak here throughout 1985. And this particular show left a lot of great cliffhangers for later dates. You know, what's going on with the North American title picture? What's going to happen with the Mid-South title picture? Or tag title picture? You know, when people talk about good episodic television, I always like using these shows as models to demonstrate how you can actually effectively make that happen. Well, we will leave it there. Another Friday podcast in the record book, and boy howdy. I noticed too when I was updating my playlist on my channel, I didn't do a head count, but done a lot of shows over the last several years. The formatting is very basic, but consistency is key. I would definitely argue this has been the most inconsistent of all the years I've been doing this. But still enjoy it. It's a fun hobby, and you know, it's one of the few passions that I really still have aside from music in this world. So, make of that as you wish. But we will be back this coming Monday for the King of the Ring pay-per-view. I don't think I'm going to have enough time to do the following Retro Raw, so it'll just be the 1997 King of the Ring recap. But that is what the game plan is for now. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take care, and peace out.